Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar. Hello, I'm Marc Jones and I'm going to be part facilitator and presenter for tonight's presentation. Just before we start, if any of you require any Dairy Pro points, there's a chat feature on the side of your internet. Could you please type in your name, address, postcode and date of birth on that chat? And then also we have a question panel also on the side. And if you have any questions, if you could please put them on there and we will ask Jim later on at the end of the presentation. So tonight we've got a series of webinars which are going to be jointly sponsored by AHDB and Field Options. And Field Options supply the fodder beets Geronimo and Lactating for grazing. And these are bred by Vermont, who are actually owned by KWS. Tonight we're going to be talking about the transition of fodder beets and particularly of cattle. We'll have a quick mention of sheep later on. This is the first in a series of 5 webinars. Transition tonight. We'll do beef on the 26th of October, dairy on the 27th, sheep on the 2nd of November, and agronomy on the 9th of November. So the speakers for tonight, firstly, we've got Reese Owing up, which you can see on the webcam. So Reese works for Field Option and is a specialist with fodder beet on agronomy. Reese will be in the background tonight for questions, but he will also be involved later in the series of webinars, particularly on the agronomy. We've then got myself, Marc Jones. So I'm a grazing and forage consultant. So I work with quite a few demonstration farms with AHDB, looking for them to implement rotational grazing. I'm also working alongside Field Options to grow the acreage of fodder beet and graze fodder beet, particularly across the UK. And then finally, we have the main speaker, which is Dr. Jim Gibbs. Jim is a research scientist in ruminant nutrition at Lincoln University in New Zealand. He's also a trained veterinarian, and over the last 10 years, much of his research is concentrated on fodder beet particularly. And really, he's been the main driver of increasing grazed beet from 10 hectares to 70,000 hectares over this period in New Zealand. So I'd like to now hand over to Jim, and we'll get the webinar started.
Thank you, Marc, and good evening to the UK listeners in this webinar series. Thank you for AHDB for organising this. As Marc has said, we've got a series of these, so we're doing transition tonight, and we've got the space to go into it for some detail. The plan this evening is that we would start with some basic information around fodder beet. Perhaps there are some people who aren't familiar with some of the features of that crop, those that are specific to the issues around transition that we'd be talking about, then some general transition issues, and then looking specifically at the how-to and the protocols of transition onto the crop for a number of different livestock classes. And for us, that'll be adult cattle, yearling cattle, and sheep. So we'll get moving on that, I think. Marc has hinted at this before, but I guess the first thing to say is that the grazing systems that we'll be talking about tonight and the transition onto those grazing systems are a really very recent innovation. Within the last 15 years in New Zealand, those systems have been pioneered. And they, as Marc had pointed out, they have been very popular with farmers, and there's a simple reason for it, that the crop offers a way to bank a lot of valuable high energy dry matter in the warm growing seasons of spring and summer, and then hold those very high dry matters across the cool seasons. And as a consequence, they've changed the winter grazing focus in New Zealand, and particularly in the beef finishing sectors. Previously, the winters were seen as a time to hold on, almost survival, and now they can be very effectively and profitably used as a productive season with high live weight gains. So the two things that have really pushed that along are first and foremost the high yields, and secondly the very high energy that's consistent right across those cold seasons. And they're the two issues that come into play with transitioning onto the crop as well. If you're not familiar with it, there's a couple of important features of the crop that also lend themselves to an explanation of transition. The first is that, as a general rule of thumb, an agronomically well-grown crop will have somewhere between 20 and 25% of the total dry matter of the plant in the leaf, and then the remainder in the bulb. Now, the leaf and the bulb are very different. The leaf will have a much higher crude protein content and a much greater mineral content, while the bulb is effectively a sugar bomb. It can be 50, and sometimes for fodder beet even more, of the total dry matter that are in that bulb in the form of sucrose. So in that sense, it's a very available, rapidly fermentable carbohydrate. Now, because of that high yield and the leaf, it's always strip grazed, and the utilisation of it is really high. So what that means is that there's a very large amount in a small area that's available to the animals. And again, that's the issue that has to be addressed directly in transition. Now, these grazing diets, if people weren't familiar with them, are using beet as a primary diet. So that would mean, in many cases, for example, the beef animals in front of you, that beet would be above 90% of the total diet, and it would be strip grazed directly out of the ground, and there'd be something else that would make up a small component of that diet. It's often pasture, and on occasion it will be grass silage or hay. So the first thing with transition to address is that that's clearly a big shift in diet for the animal. And more importantly, we'll repeat this again several times through the webinar, but the important component to understand about transition is that there's no plan B. All the profitability and productivity of beet systems are entered into through that transition program. And if it goes wrong, it can often be very difficult to rescue the rest of the season. So transition really is that doorway to the very high intakes that are able to be achieved with beet. And there's no second plan if they're not able to be achieved. And that really is the heart and soul of transition. Now, because we're shifting in most cases these animals from another forage diet onto beet, it's worth spending a moment discussing some of the changes in the animal, in the rumen particularly, but also in the broader animal that have to happen when they're moving on to beet. Now, if they're moving from a pasture-based system onto a beet grazing system, then they're going to come into a circumstance where, for their rumen particularly, suddenly there's a far greater water component. They're eating a lot more water. It's a low dry matter feed. There's a very high sugar component in that, so there's a lot of fermentable carbohydrates in them, and there's a relatively low crude protein content compared to pasture. Now, as most of the listeners will be aware, ruminants are different to monogastrics in the way that they transfer energy from their diet to their bodies. In the case of monogastrics like ourselves or pigs, what we do with those carbohydrates, particularly the simple sugars, is that we digest them directly, absorb them directly, and then use them in the cells in that form. Ruminants don't do that. Ruminants instead transfer that dietary energy to their bodies by taking those carbohydrates and in the rumen fermenting them to another form. And then the other form is absorbed and used directly as an energy source. Now, the other form that it's fermented to is an organic acid. So like all acids, if there's an accumulation of them, they present a risk to tissue and all biological systems. So the way that ruminants handle this, at least most of the acids that are produced, is to remove them. And that removal, again, in the bulk of that removal, takes place through the rumen wall, through the rumen epithelial blood flow. So this presents the second difficulty with transition to fodder beet systems. The other thing that we'd mentioned is that they're low dry matter feeds and they have a tremendous amount of water. And to give you some scale for that, if we have a feedlot fed adult cattle beast, then in a day, their total water intake, that's what they drink and what they eat in the feed, would be less than 50 litres. And they'd often be drinking 25 litres or so. If we're to take the top end of the beet intakes on the very low dry matter fodder beet varieties, these animals can be eating 120, 130 litres a day. So they're wildly overhydrated. Now, that water also has to be removed from the rumen because there's issues around normal rumen function with concentrations, etc. But the difficulty is that when it's removed and it's removed to the blood also has fairly strict limits on how much water it can take up in a period of time, because if it's diluted, it also loses function. So at the other end, the kidneys have to adapt to a much higher water load and to excreting a far greater proportion of the water that they're taking in than they normally would. And if they don't, then the intake of the animal will slow. So there's two separate issues that are taking place in transition, directly in the rumen and beyond in the animal. And then the third one to talk about is that the principal mechanism by which animals adjust to having very high sugar load feeds is by changing the rate of intake. So if you like, they change the rate that they shovel the coal into the boiler, and they come to understand, they don't learn this themselves, they'll eat themselves into an early grave if you let them, but they come to understand, and we can train them to shovel that coal into the boiler at a rate that doesn't melt the boiler down. So the three components of transition that are really important to look at are the sugar load, the water load, and to remember that the most important component of transition is between their ears, and it's training them to eat at a rate that matches their rumen losses. It's important to note there that if it's a poor transition, there's no rescuing it. Rumen acidosis as a clinical syndrome in ruminants is a serious disease. It's associated with significant illness and can be stock deaths. And after that, there can be damage to various tissues, the rumen and liver in particular, and none of them are associated with high production or high profit. In beef animals in particular, the clinical manifestations of rumen acidosis are relatively rare compared to dairy cattle, but what you do undertake if you've done that badly is to produce in them a very strong feed aversion. In other words, you've taught them not to eat a lot of fodder beet. They learn that lesson very well, and they won't make you any money after that. So poor transition is a very costly process. So the most important 2 weeks of the entire system are those first few weeks when we're undertaking that good transition to achieve really high intakes, the full intakes that we can obtain with them, and to have the minimum amount of interventions that are all costly. So how do we achieve that? Well, the principle underlying all of the stock class transitions, with the possible exception of sheep, which we'll address lastly, is that we have to restrict the intake. The animals won't restrict their intake. So we have to restrict their intake. And the second component of this is that unlike cereal grain diets, which share some of the sugar load that beet does, the relatively lower dry matter of those diets mean that it's a different transition period. And in beet, it will always be a minimum of 14 days. There's various changes in the rumen and the physiology of the animal and their understanding of intake itself that will always require 14 days. So in principle, what we're doing is we're starting at a low level of that beet, and then we're working up slowly over that period to get to full and unrestricted intake. And we'll discuss them for each of the livestock classes in sequence. You can appreciate then that if we're going to restrict feed them and we're going to give them a small amount of beet to start with, that it can be very difficult, particularly given it's a high yielding crop. And by high yielding, the highest yields in this current season in New Zealand were approaching 45 tonnes of dry matter a hectare. That means that in a 10,000 square metres in a hectare, that's 4.5 kilos of dry matter in every square metre. Now, the killing dose for an adult animal being exposed to it for the first time is 3 kilos of dry matter. So you can appreciate that it can be quite difficult with that high yield to adequately restrict them to a smaller diet. Now, if that's the challenge, then the solution for it, put simply, is to have good design and good planning. And so we'll talk about several of these in order, but particularly space, yield, both estimation of that yield and allocation of that yield, and how we do our medium-term and short-term timing, and overlaid across all of it is a patient approach to this. Now, the picture to your left there was an AHDB field day in Northern England last year. It's a great example of a farmer who's taken what we're about to explain to heart. He did an excellent job on this. You can see from where the crowd is, the edge of the fodder beet there to the right-hand side of the photo, that there's a large headland there which is grassed out. Now, one of the difficulties if you're restricting feed and you're going to increase it slowly over 14 days, and the principal difficulty originally in New Zealand was that farmers would traditionally have planted the alternative winter crops to the 4 points of the compass in their paddock. And the approach with brassicas were that the electric fence was then put in to give them a bit of break. They would trample it, they would eat some, and over a period of time, they would make themselves space. Now, the difficulty that you have with beet is that you don't have the liberty to do that because you're providing them with a square meterage that's well beyond a safe allocation for them. So the first thing that we did was introduce the use of headlands. So these headlands were bare of beet. They could either be planted out, as in the example that's in front of us there now, or they could be created after by the use of a beet bucket, which would clear that headland across. Now, there are some rules of thumb for those headlands. As a rule of thumb, if the headland is less than 6 meters, it'll generally present a problem. And the reason is that if it's less than 6 meters, the shire and lighter cattle won't be very keen to walk behind the other dominant cattle. They won't get trapped into an area, and so you don't get an even spread across the line. And that brings us to the second of these space issues. There's a very strong rule of thumb with cattle that they require 1 meter of linear line space per animal. Now, if you go underneath that, then what you do is you squeeze out the lighter and shyer animals. The way that they eat beet is relatively slow and patient. And if you reduce that linear line space, then they won't stand there next to the more dominant animals. So what happens in those cases is they get pushed away. Now, both of those things have the same effect. When you're allocating very carefully and you're starting with a mob and you're allocating at low dry matter intakes to begin with, if you have a significant proportion of the mob that aren't eating, that means that there's an equal size proportion of that mob at the other end that now have double, and they'll take you up on it. So they're no longer eating 1 or 2 kilograms of dry matter to begin with, they're eating 2 or 4. And then the further you go through that transition, the worse it becomes. So uniformity of that mob is a critical component in first the allocation, but in the actual consumption of that beet. And it's what we principally look for when we're trying to provide them space. Now, the third aspect of space that has to come into play is because we are restricting them to a small amount to begin with, a few kilos, if we want those animals to be fully fed, and we do, and if they're not fully fed, they'll put a lot more pressure on the electric wire, which causes more issues. So if we want them to be fully fed, we've got to make sure that they all have access to another non-beet component of their diet, whether that's pasture, as in the photo in front, or whether that's supplement in different systems. We have to make sure that the access that they have to that is even. So again, we have all of the mob who are able to access that diet. The next one, we'll spend a moment on yield, both estimating and allocating yields. Now, of course, if we're going to limit this to several kilos to begin with, then we have to be accurately in possession of what the yield in the crop is. And this is different from the traditional sugar beet yields, because the sugar beet gold standard in the end was the truck leaving the paddock and delivering it to the factory. In our case, we have to know about it before we allocate this in the transition period. Now, we'll present for reference at the back a paper that was done specifically on this some years ago in New Zealand when we were beginning this, and the reasons why we're using some of the figures that we are clearer in that publication. Now, in estimating that yield, we're helped by the fact that it's a precision planted crop. So it'll be in rows, and we're going to, for ease of mathematics in this example, we're going to use the traditional 50 centimetre rows, and the plants are spaced at direct levels up that row as well. So what we can say for this is that if we've got a 50 centimetre row precision planted crop, then in 1 square metre, we're going to have 2 rows of 1 metre each. So that means that we have the opportunity, that's to be 1 metre squared out of the 10,000 metre squares in the hectare. So what that means is we have the opportunity to weigh this accurately. And what we do is we take 5 metre rows, and then we use that row and the row next to it. Now, because we're using the 2 rows, that means I have 5 metres squared. And we would repeat that at another 4 sites across the crop. Now, if we use less than 5 metres, so you see occasionally 2 metres that's done, and that's a very poor idea because beet plant number variability is a big driver of these yield assessments. So 5 metres is the minimum to do. And 4 or 5 sites across the crop also apprehends the variability in different areas and soil types, etc. across the crop. Now, if we've done that, then what we end up with is something like 20 or 25 metres square that we've actually sampled. So what we do is we weigh that, scrape the soil off it, we weigh that bulb, the whole plant, and cut the leaf off it, and weigh the leaf or bulb again, and that way we have a leaf and bulb wet weight. Now, if we send representative samples, 1 or 2 of those plants off to get actual dry matter of the leaf and actual dry matter of the bulb, then what we can do is correct that to dry matter, and we can then correct our sample site to the 10,000 square metres in the hectare, and therefore get a yield. And it's a very accurate way to do it. We can then use that yield to allocate, and we can have the same approach we see in front of us. Because it is planted in rows, if we were to graze across the rows rather than up the rows, as in the photo in front of us there, then what we can do is we can use the rows in allocation every day. Now, there's a simple rule of thumb. Many of the crops currently in the British system have approximately 20 tonnes, often a little less than 20 tonnes of dry matter a hectare. And by doing fairly straightforward maths on that, 20,000 kilograms of dry matter is 2 kilograms of dry matter per metre square in that hectare. Or another way of putting it is that for a 20-tonne crop, each linear metre of that row is a single kilogram of dry matter. So if we're putting the wire up along that row, we can use those rows to allocate very accurately. And that's the way that it's done in New Zealand. I would just note there that you should be aware that there's some relatively poor information that's available in different places that suggests that you can otherwise do the allocation on time. And the idea with this is that it's a known fact that cattle eat at a certain rate of intake, and therefore you can put them on for a short period and then a longer period, and you're mimicking the 1 kilo, 2 kilo, 3 kilos. I want to be really clear on this. That's not an effective way. And in many years of doing troubleshooting right from the beginning of this process in grazing, I could say an awful lot of those troubleshooting situations came out of people using time, including some ugly lawsuits in recent years. It's a very ineffective way to allocate. What you end up with is animals on for a short time that only eat leaf. It's not noticed. They're not interested because they know that people are going to come and get them back out of the paddock pretty soon. So they stay there. You get a portion of the group that are overeating, a portion that are undereating. When they finally run out of something else to eat, they begin to eat it as well, and then they go from 0 to 100 in a very short time. So you get troubles all over the mob in those cases. So allocating on yield is the gold standard to approach this. Allocating on time is a very poor way to go about it. And speaking of timing, there's a few things in timing that can make transition a lot easier. The first of these is that, all things being considered, it's much easier to transition cattle onto the crop when it's dry and warm. It's much more difficult in muddy and difficult wet, cold situations. So wherever possible, putting them on when it's dry and warm is an advantage. It always takes animals a while to learn to eat bulbs, particularly young stock. So the yearling cattle, takes them a while to learn to mouth bulbs and to do it. But even animals that have been on year after year after year, in the case of our wintering dairy cows in New Zealand, it still takes about a week for them to get up to intake levels. Now, that's dangerous because they're not ready after a week for that intake level. But what it does mean is that there's an adaptation each time to relearning how to chew on those bulbs. And you have to be patient and make sure that the animals are actually eating bulbs. In the photo in front of us, you can see that animals will go on and they'll always eat the leaf. And sometimes people can get that wrong. They think that they're all eating. They'll all eat the leaf because it appears to them like any normal forage. It's them getting onto the bulb that takes more time. And that brings us to the third one, which is the time that you spend on crop. If we're allocating a couple of kilos to begin with for these animals, then in most cases, once they're up and moving on that, they can eat that in a relatively short period of time. However, if for convenience that you're putting them onto that crop to begin with and then you're removing them after a short while, cattle are very clever on times and they'll work you out. And if they know that you're going to come back and move, then those animals who aren't particularly interested in eating beet will wait by the gate. They might have a nibble of the leaf, it's no help to anybody, and then they'll wait by the gate and they'll wait for you to come and get them out. So as a general rule of thumb, what we try and do is not take them out before 3 or so hours. So every time they go onto that crop, even though they have to stand around there for a while, perhaps with nothing there, it's long enough for them to realise that they're not going to be hooked out quickly, and that encourages them all to begin eating rather than to avoiding it. Now, the final issue is another very common misunderstanding, and that is that in the early stages, you should fill the animals up with some other feed before you put them onto beet. So I hope it's plain from what we've said so far that animals actually have a short period when they're moving on to beet where they have to adapt and to get onto that. There's a common misunderstanding that cattle all love beet to begin with and will hoe into it quickly. No, they won't. Even animals that have had it now, in our case, some of our early farmers are now 13 years in a row. Every animal on the farm has been wintered on fodder beet systems for that period of time. Even in those circumstances, it still takes some days up to a week before all the animals will get back onto eating it. So to make that easier, what we would normally do is use the daily rhythm of their feeding to your advantage, not putting them on when they're full, but allocating carefully on dry matter and putting them on when they're hungry. Now that encourages a greater proportion of the mob to quickly move on to eating beet. It can be very difficult in some circumstances if you're putting them on full and you end up with a 30% odd population who aren't going to eat at all. We're going to look specifically at a couple of systems now. So we'll start with the adult cattle. In the case of New Zealand, this is wintering dairy cows or the rising 2-year-old spring-born steers and heifers that are going into their second winter that are going to be finished in that winter for sale in the higher schedule markets. Now, we've already discussed some of the background around space, which is that we'd always allocate them 1 metre, at least 1 metre. Note that there's no great advantage in going over that metre. Once you go beyond that, there's no specific help in encouraging access to the crop. So we'd have that 1 linear metre per beast, and we'd have the 6 metre headland. We would normally start them at 1 to 2 kilograms of dry matter, and that would mean that to be fully fed, and they need to be fully fed for good transition, or else they're putting pressure on the line, that what we would then have is another component of their diet. 7 to 8 kilograms of dry matter is typical for this. Now, because of the expense of conserved feeds, as a general rule, wherever possible, we would use pasture in that place. However, you can use any of the conserved feeds that are palatable enough for them to eat. Now, the first and most important component is that when they go on, that you don't move off that initial 1 to 2 kilograms of dry matter until you're confident that the whole group is eating. So it isn't automatically that they're going to be there for just a couple of days. They're going to be on that until all of them are known to be eating. Now, if it's abiding by the principles that we've already presented, that can be a short program, particularly in dairy cows, which are born to eat. That can be a very short program, so that can be within a few days. But in young stock, particularly replacement dairy heifers, 150 kilos or so, or 250, 300 kilo beef weaners, they can be quite fussy and they'll often take a longer period of time. But we would start them on that amount of beet, and then once we're confident that they're all eating, after that, then they can move up no more than 1 kilogram every second day. So note, they're not moving up every day. That's no help to them. In fact, that's not the way that they adapt to beet. They adapt episodically, so moving up every second day is much more effective, and they'd move up 1 kilogram of dry matter until they're reaching full intakes. They fairly dependably eat about 2.2% of their own live weight in dry matter a day. So to keep the maths easy, for a 500 kilo wintering dairy cow, that means that they'll eat a maximum of about 11 kilos of beet a day, no more than that. And so doing your sums, starting at 1 to 2 kilos, you can see that it's over 14 days until they actually achieve that full intake. In general terms, what would happen is they'd start first week on 7 to 8 kilograms of something other than beet in their diet. Logistically, that would normally be kept for the first week, and then it would be dropped down to 4 kilos in the second week, and then 2.5 kilos to make sure that there's 2 kilos consumed for week 3 and thereafter. Now, in some cases, because of that pasture or supplement component going in there, for convenience, they'll have a paddock next door where they're fed on that. and they'll be walked onto the beet and then walked off, often in daylight hours. Note that after day 4 or 5, it's recommended that you don't take them off the beet anymore, because you're starting to train them to spread their intake out over the whole day rather than eat in a competitive fashion and take all of that beet in within a short time. That can provide further difficulties. Now, if we extend that a little bit to lactating cows, the difference is in lactating cows that you don't have the same opportunity with their daily rhythm to provide them with hunger as a tool to use. We don't want them to be hungry when they're lactating because milk production is affected. So effectively, we don't have the stick, we only have the carrot. Now, most in pasture-based systems, the maximum fodder beet that will be included is about 5 kilos of dry matter. That constitutes about a third of their diet. So in those cases, they still start at 1 to 2 kilograms a day, but the difference is that it'll often be an extended transition. So they typically will be much slower to get onto the beet because there'll be a significant proportion that aren't interested in eating it. So it becomes very important, the timing of that beet being put out there. If that's put out there after they've had their daily break allocation, for example, then it's very common for a significant proportion, 30% or so, that won't be eating that beet. That means there's another 30% that now have double, and that's where a lot of the transition issues in lactation come from. Now, to get around that, that beet should be put out on the pasture, or they should be put to graze that beet on the platform when they're at their hungriest for the day for the allocation. And they should often stay on that 1 kilo until the owner is satisfied that all of those animals are actually eating that bulb and eating that completely. And commonly that would be between 5 and 7 days on a single kilo or 2 kilos of dry matter before they're confident that all the animals are doing that. Once they're all switched on to eating it, they then can be moved up quite quickly. It's switching them on that's the difficulty in transition, particularly in these lactation animals. Now, note if they're put out on a pasture or if they're grazing it, a simple way to encourage this is to put a tractor wheel across the beet and smash it to pieces. Even if they've seen it before, smashing it to pieces like that will encourage a quicker uptake of intake across the whole mob. I'm now going to turn it over to Marc Jones, who's going to talk about yearling cattle and the transition process on that before we move on to sheep. So, Marc, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So I suppose just in terms of yearling cattle and the R1s, I suppose to put a bit of a UK context on it, we have a lot of all year round calving dairy herds. We have a lot of dairy beef coming out with different age groups coming onto the beet in the winter. We've also got, your simpler bred cattle, early spring born and autumn born as well. So generally we have a range of weights from anything from 200 to 400 kilos. And I suppose really our focus for the R1s or the yearling cattle really is a range of 200 to 350 kilos. And we're going to treat these a little bit different. So anything above 350 kilos we treat just as Jim mentioned in the transition process. So the first thing we need to remember is that these younger cattle are a lot fussier in terms of their eating. So it's really important that we've got really good agronomy for the fodder beets. So we're looking for nice green fresh leaf to leave. It's also very important to get a cultivar or type of fodder beet which is very palatable as well. So again, because they're that little bit more fussy, there is the chance that they'll get on and eat the beet. The other point we need to be thinking about is probably the transition process is going to last 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks really for the younger cattle. And this is because they're generally a lot slower to get onto the beet and get them eating it to start with. So what we'd suggest really is trying to lift some of the beet. So this can either be done by a beet bucket, lifted by a contractor, or even just by buying a truckload off a farmer nearby. And really we'd be aiming to sprinkle fodder beet out of grass probably for 5 to 7 days in front of those cattle. I know the key point here is that we'd also want to try and smash that beet open to get them to eat it and sniff it a little bit quicker. But we also have to try and force them to eat it really. So when we're looking at that rotational grazing in that week before they actually go onto the fodder beet, it's important we almost need to make those cattle hungry. So we'll be aiming to put the fodder beet out onto grass probably that hour or 2 or 3 hours before you actually move them onto a new fresh patch of grass. Then they're hungry and looking to eat something. The other slight difference we have with the younger cattle is that we're aiming to, rather than increase the increments of fodder beet by a full kilo of dry matter a day, we're actually looking to do it by half a kilo. So the maximum intake of these animals is going to be around 6 kilos. So we're really aiming to notch it up that half a kilo every other day. The only slight issue we have is it's not quite as easy to do once we're actually in the fodder beet paddock itself. So we're aiming to get them up to 1 or 2 kilos. It's easier to do that in the field. And then when we actually get into the fodder beet, we sometimes have to reduce the linear meter we give per head to half a meter initially, just so that we're giving them that 1 row and half a kilo of dry matter a day. And then the important thing is we're looking then to make sure that no animals are actually getting bullied out of that line. And then our aim is, as Jim mentioned, would be to increase that half a kilo up every other day, and so on. But the other difference is, I suppose, once we've got over that initial intake of fodder beet and we've got them up to about 2 kilos of dry matter, we could actually step it up then by 1 kilo at a time. But we would aim to do it over a slightly longer period. So rather than every other day, we'd probably push it out to about 3 days. So then that would make that transition a little bit simpler to manage. Again, we could then increase that linear length from half a meter to a meter each. So then there's no chance of the cattle getting bullied. And like we mentioned, the key thing for it is to try, that transition is going to be near a 3-week period throughout. Another aspect to it is really looking at vaccinations and animal health. So really, because the cattle are eating large amounts of soil, we've got to be wary of clostridial diseases. So again, a tanging one it should be 2 doses of that a month before they go on the fodder beet, unless you're giving it in the spring as well. We're also looking at trace elements. So again, we can have issues particularly with copper. So whether you want to bolus the cattle prior to going on. I know Jim will mention a little bit more of this towards the end of the talk. Again, there's more of an issue with the trace elements in your soil and whether that will lock up rather than what's actually in the crop itself. And then the basic stuff, again, drenching those younger cattle before they're going on to the fodder beet to clear them out from any worms during that season. So I'd like to just again pass back on to Jim.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So we'll speak briefly about sheep, and then we'll talk about some of the other transition checklists, and then we'll turn it over to questions. It should be noted first and foremost that as a general rule, lambs don't finish well on beet. We mentioned earlier that the crude protein of the total crop, which is well suited to cattle and is suited to larger, heavier ewes, is not suitable for lamb finishing as a rule because the total crude protein of the crop falls under the threshold of maximum live weight gain. They can be held effectively doing 100 or 150 grams on it, but they're not going to achieve the very high live weight gains that we see cattle doing. However, wintering ewes, and multiples in particular, they do very well on it. And they do well on it because, unlike cattle, which we said before, will dependably eat a maximum of about 2.2% of their live weight, sheep will eat well into past 3% of their live weight, even heavily pregnant ewes eating up to 3.5% of their live weight. And of course, it's a very high metabolizable energy diet. So, for example, the multiples can easily and rapidly achieve well over their metabolizable energy requirements for all but the last week or so of their gestation. So wintering ewes are done in very large numbers in New Zealand. There's a mix. People would be co-grazing some of them with a very small amount of grass. or no other supplement at all, 100% beet systems. Now, they regulate their intake very differently from cattle, and while they have the same broader transition process of beyond the rumen, so for example, the renal physiology, adapting to these higher water loads and the things that we've mentioned before, they regulate their intake so that clinical acidosis is vanishingly rare. In an entire career of doing this, I've seen very, very few individual animals who've ever been affected by acidosis, sheep that is, on crop. So the classic approach to transition for sheep is that they'll be run on and off to get them used to it for a couple of hours, for a couple of days, and then they'll be locked onto the crop. Now, note, they still have those same processes going, so they don't actually achieve their maximum intakes for about 3 weeks. It's just that they regulate their way up to those higher intakes much better than cattle do. So transition is a very different process for sheep than it is for cattle. Right, we'll just look at this transition checklist and we'll turn it over to questions. So Mark has already mentioned a couple of these, but what we would, this isn't strictly speaking part of the nutritional approach to transition, but it's just a practical transition checklist to look at. We would always vaccinate. The specific clostridial disease that's most common is Clostridium perfringens type D, which farmers would be used to in sheep a little as pulpy kidney. So the older clostridial vaccines work very effectively on this. The old 5-in-1s or so work very effectively in preventing this. But young stock in particular are quite sensitive to this. As Mark pointed out, there's a lot of clostridial spores in soil, which they eat a lot of. And the other component is that there's a high sugar load that makes its way into the small intestine as well. And overgrowth of Clostridium in that small intestine is relatively common. And the clostridial vaccines work very well to prevent that. So we would make sure that all of the cattle are effectively vaccinated for clostridial diseases before they're onto the crop. In New Zealand, trace elements are a bigger issue than they are typically in the UK, but in other countries of the world where there's beet grazing systems now, there's always a various local trace element to be looked at. The usual ones are copper, as Mark has mentioned, selenium, cobalt, iodine, and getting local veterinary advice on what's required is important, but do note that beet does have a lot of water. There's a very large urinary volume that's produced, and therefore excretion of some minerals is a little higher than it would be in ordinary systems. So as a general rule, trace element supplementation by injection is a very positive way to go about it. We would always drench these animals before they went onto the crop. While they're on the crop, they're not going to get more larvae unless they're co-grazing a pasture at the same time. Now, other checklists for them is that we've got our sufficient space, our 6 metres of headland, we've got 1 metre per beast along that space, and that we've got adequate access for whatever pasture or supplement that we're doing, and that we're feeding the right amount of that to keep them fully fed over that transition period, which avoids putting pressure on the line. And as we said, wherever possible, do it in the earlier, warmer and drier weather for cattle and for sheep, but sheep are a lot easier to deal with. For sheep, our spacing requirement is obviously a lot tighter, and we work on 3 to 4 per linear metre. In some cases, that's increased temporarily anyway, that's increased even more. And if that is the case, then utilisation of the crop tends to go down because they're trapping more leaf into the ground. And in their cases, it's a very firm requirement for clostridial vaccines. Losses in sheep that aren't vaccinated can be extremely high. We would normally drench them as well. In most cases, the trace element supply is a little different, and it doesn't appear to be the same difficulty that it is in cattle. But getting local advice on what elements are lacking is important for them as well. So with that, the easiest way to put it is that there's no shortcuts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark and the AHDB coordinators to put the questions forward, and we're happy to do so.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. So the first question coming in is, which cattle are most dangerous to transition?
Dairy cows. To answer that properly, dairy cows are selected for higher and higher intakes, and by far and away they're the most dangerous stock to transition. The next it really falls along a live weight basis. So the next ones that are at risk are rising 2-year-old steers and heifers. And then at the bottom of that list would be dairy replacement heifers, the very light ones particularly, and R1 beef steers. But having said that, one of the very common difficulties that are faced in beef finishing systems when people are new to beef is that they will have as their key performance indicator of transition that animals didn't get sick or there were no stock losses. And it's important to reiterate what we said earlier, that the greatest profitability loss in beef finishing systems in transition is that you induce in them a feed aversion to beet. They will learn very well, like we do, that they ate something and it caused them great distress. And what they'll do after that is they'll eat to stay alive, but they won't eat for production. So all of the cattle classes are susceptible to poor transition, but where you see the most overt clinical acidosis is always in dairy cows. And if that allocation is done very poorly, and often that is by using time as a way to put animals on and to adapt them onto the crop, then the losses in some of these circumstances can be very high, and the subsequent damage to rumen, liver, etc. else can also be very high. So very definitely dairy cows are the riskiest ones to move on.
Okay. Next question, but I think you've covered some of this. Why do we need to vaccinate for Clostridial diseases?
Yeah. Well, there's two separate components to the Clostridial disease, and this was a novel finding when the beet grazing systems were initially being put in place. The first one is that Clostridium spores stay in the soil for a long time, and the soil intake in beet grazing systems is very high. Historically, the idea was that high soil intakes were a problem, were an animal health problem. And people would present that in different ways. Sometimes they would say that soil degraded the lining of the rumen or the intestines, etc. That's patently false, and we might come back to that in a moment. Sometimes people would say that it presented a trace element issue because they're eating a lot of iron or they're eating a lot of other minerals, and that may well tie up things like copper, which is true. In certain circumstances, you have to be more careful with trace element supplementation on it. But the one that is most problematic is the fact that these Clostridial spores stay there a long time, and in certain circumstances they can be at very high concentrations. In the New Zealand situation, what will sometimes happen is that the paddocks that are put into beet have been pasture grazing paddocks beforehand where there was a stock camp, for example, and they'll have a very high loading of fecal-derived Clostridium, and the spores in those soils can be really high. And when they have the high soil intake that is associated with beet, and it can be very high, it doesn't have any other issues beyond that, but it can be very high, then Clostridial disease is seen much more frequently in non-vaccinated animals. The reason why that Clostridial disease is seen, given that all winter feeding, all winter grazing has some soil intake and therefore Clostridial intake, is that beet with a very high sucrose content and an extremely high water content means that you have a lot of rumen overflow that carries a lot of fermentable carbohydrate into the small intestine. So Clostridium perfringens type D likes both sucrose and glucose and can grow in the small intestine rapidly in response to them, therefore producing more of those toxins. So beet is uniquely situated to provide Clostridial problems for cattle and for sheep. And we would always make sure that the vaccinations are done beforehand in young stock and that there's annual boosters for the older cattle. It's reasonably rare to see genuine Clostridial outbreaks on beet in dairy cows, and you don't normally see a large number of animals that are affected, but you only have to have a few steers tip over to justify the cost of all the vaccination many times over. So it's something that we're very firm on.
Okay. The next question in, Jim, when should we sloop drench cattle? Normally they would, obviously if they're housing, they would do it at housing.
Well, while the animals are on the beet crop, if they're locked on the beet crop and they're being fed a conserved feed, so for example, if they're being fed out silage every day, then there's effectively zero larval intake over that period. Doesn't matter how long they're on the crop, there'll be zero larval intake. There's no larvae on the cultivated beet crops. So in those circumstances, drenching once before they go on, even if they're going to be on for extended periods of time, and it's not uncommon for the rising one-year-old beef yearlings to be on for 150 days in the New Zealand system, from sort of early or mid-autumn right through to the grass appearing in spring. And in those circumstances, there's no requirement for them to be drenched again. In general terms, we would make sure that they're drenched immediately before going on the crop. However, it's always more cost effective and typically associated with higher live weight gains if people are using pasture as the other component of the diet. So there's no firm requirement for silage or straw or any of the roughages. Pasture provides all of the fibre that's required as an ancillary supplement to the beet crop grazing. And in circumstances where pasture is being grazed, even a small amount of that, then they are taking larvae in, and in most cases we would then drench somewhere within that season again. So drenching before they go on, drenching mid-season.
Okay. In terms of the symptoms of over-intake and transition, what would they be and what would be the likely treatment?
Yeah. It depends a little bit on the livestock class, but the general signs that something has gone wrong and you're seeing the early stages of clinical acidosis is that the animals will be slow to come to the face in the morning when the break is given. So the very earliest sign of this will be that these animals will not come forward quickly and vigorously to eat the leaf. All the stock like the leaf and they'll all come forward to eat that leaf. If you see those animals lagging behind, particularly if there's a 5% of the mob that are lagging behind, it's normally a sign that there's some sort of digestive upset. As that progressively increases, or if it's greater in severity, the very first signs that are seen are an apparent drunkenness in these ruminants. The very earliest sign of rumen acidosis in sugar overload as opposed to grain overload, the very earliest sign of that is a hypocalcemia. So if you like, a milk fever type syndrome. And before they go down, and they won't typically go down in the same way that they would with traditional milk fever, but before they do go to the ground, what they'll show is an incoordination. So in the New Zealand parlance, farmers would say that they had wobbled them. So when they walk, they're not coordinated and they have sort of ataxia where they wobble over the place and have an apparent drunkenness. And that's a telltale sign of low-grade rumen acidosis in the mob. As that acidosis is greater and greater in severity, for example, if they're wildly over-allocated, then you won't often see any of those signs. What will happen is that you appear in the morning and fairly dependably, if they're given 3 kilos of dry matter or more, then what will happen, so that's 3 kilos of dry matter or more from the day before in that transition period, then what will happen is 5% will be on the ground and another 5, sometimes 10% will be on their feet but wobbly and affected. It's an interesting component of beet that even if the wire goes down and the entire mob go across the crop, you never ever have a large percentage of the group that are affected. It's always fairly firmly around that 5% that are significantly affected, with another additional 10% that are less severely affected but noticeably affected. And then there's the largest proportion of the group that's not affected at all. It's a very characteristic feature of beet intake. So that 5% that are on the ground present a genuine problem. Traditional methods of treating rumen acidosis were attempt to alkalise that rumen pH. So in the UK experience, that's often 100 grams of sodium bicarbonate. In the New Zealand experience, stronger alkalisers were used for a while. They and classically that was magnesium oxide at 500 grams a day. It's a extremely ineffective treatment regime. The uncomfortable reality with that is that the rumen pH is one of the things that's gone wrong, but the very high concentration of solutes in the rumen, or the so-called rumen osmolarity, is the genuine and much more destructive issue underneath that. And giving large amounts of magnesium oxide simply increases and perpetuates the issues around rumen osmolarity. So the classic treatment for rumen acidosis now in New Zealand on beet crops is to give subcutaneous calcium like you would in milk fever cases. So that'll be 1 or 2 bags if they're down when they're seen in the morning, and not to give rumen drenches at all. Some very recent research that we completed last year looking at the effect of sodium bicarbonate showed that it had no effect whatsoever on rumen pH. And the magnesium oxide, when given, had a very mild pH shift, but an extremely destructive and damaging increase in rumen osmolarity. So the most contemporary veterinary treatments for rumen acidosis on beet are simply to give calcium under the skin and to avoid giving rumen drenches. As a general rule of thumb, there'll be, in severely affected groups, there'll be 5% on the ground, and those 5% are the ones that are treated. The walking cases aren't treated. There's no great benefit in treating them. If they're walking, they will normally recover. A small number of them, 1 in 10, will go down after that, but as a general rule, they'll recover without any treatment. Of those that are on the ground that are given calcium, that's typically given in the morning. Those that aren't up within 8 hours of that calcium being administered normally represent a grave prognosis and typically aren't going to get up ever. So the short summary of that one is that rumen drenches are often ineffective, and pain relief and calcium under the skin to change that hypercalcemia are the most effective treatments for rumen acidosis on beet.
There's a question which is just coming on cows and calves. Is it possible to graze cows and calves together for late springborn, or are they always better if they're weaned first?
No, it is possible to graze them together. We count the calf as half the cow, and it's usually not possible to have the full meter in those paired systems that you're describing. But yep, you can do it effectively. In fact, with beef animals, unlike dairy, because of their lower milk production, we've calved animals on the crop. And the calves do very well on beet. The mothers obviously do very well because their high energy intake means they have a high milk production. But the calves also seem to nibble away at it, and it doesn't seem to do them any harm. There's no great difficulties with them except that requirement for clostridial vaccines. Particularly in the younger calves, they're exquisitely sensitive to it. But beyond that, there's no great difficulties with it. It can be a very effective system.
Okay. Just a question on sheep. Is there any significant increase in foot rot from sheep being on fodder beet due to the extra contact of soil?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the short answer is, in some circumstances, that has been noticed. And I have seen that on occasion. It appears to be breed sensitive, as a lot of foot rot clearly is. But I have noticed in certain circumstances that foot rot has been a genuine problem, particularly where gateways were being used for co-grazing. So there are some things to be quite careful on that. In the main, however, the answer would be no. I mean, sheep are done in enormous volumes in very large mob sizes in New Zealand, particularly in the southern half of the South Island. Not uncommon to have mob sizes of several thousand, and a very large number of sheep are wintered on it. Ewes commonly and hoggets after that are wintered on it every year, and by and large it presents no problem. But in certain circumstances it has been noticed before.
There's a question, you obviously don't have this issue in New Zealand, but quite a lot of crops have been badly affected with virus yellow season because of neonicotinoids on the seed treatment. So obviously a lot less leaf. Does this pose any problems to cattle or sheep compared to a healthy crop?
Yes, it does. I know later on in this webinar series, we're going to be addressing that agronomy specifically and directly, but suffice to say that the fodder beet agronomy has taken a very strong departure from traditional sugar beet agronomy in New Zealand, and that's what we'll be talking through. In the grazing systems, it is extremely difficult to thoroughly replace what the leaf gives to the grazing crop by any other means. So the leaf has a relatively high crude protein, which can be replaced, but nearly all the sources of forage crude protein that we use have a much higher fibre than what the beet leaf does. And those, to not to put too much detail on it, we'll hold that for another one of the webinars, but the fibre requirements for maximum intake on beet are quite fussy and are relatively low. So where you're trying to replace that green leaf that's gone in agronomically challenged crops with some other form of supplement, green or otherwise, it typically represents a great difficulty. So we spend quite a lot of time and money agronomically putting a lot more nitrogen on, a lot later nitrogen on, to increase that amount of leaf and increase the health of the leaf and to hold good leaf into that winter system. So the person asking that question is right to say that without that leaf, grazing those becomes a much harder proposition, and that becomes much more difficult with lower live weight stock. So it's easy enough to do with sheep because we're not looking for maximum production typically, but for the lighter cattle, dairy replacement heifers and yearling beef weaners, it's a very strong issue, no question around it.
Okay. Yeah, so just one final question, I think that's about it. Is it an effective way to transition the yearling cattle or the R1s at grass?
Is the question that being asked there, is it cost effective or logistically possible to fully transition them on the pasture rather than graze them on the crop?
Yeah, is it effective to transition them at grass by lifting beet and taking it to them?
It's a very effective way to initiate them with the crop. It's not typically an effective way to completely transition them onto the crop. That pre-loading of beet while they're on the pasture, as you mentioned earlier, is a very important component of the beef yearling systems and the dairy replacement heifers, which are very fussy and tend to be very slow. Gives them more time to get used to the bulb, and you can modify their daily rhythm so you're putting them on when they're a bit hungrier and spend a long time at the low levels of beet input. However, once they're onto that beet and they're moving, there comes a point, typically a week or so into that process, where the advantage is to put them onto the crop. And really, at that point, there's no disincentive in putting them onto the crop, and quite a few disincentives in terms of achieving full intakes of not doing so out on the pasture. So if you're continually taking that beet out to the pasture, then it becomes progressively more difficult to limit the amount of pasture that they're eating and to switch them on to full beet intakes. Now, one of the really important components of transition is, of course, you're training that animal to eat, and you're training them to regulate their own intake, and a component of that is to make sure that they've got absolutely unrestricted intakes of beet in the end. So it is a helpful thing in the early stages, but it's typically not done to full transition. At some point, they'll be brought back to the crop.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jim. I think that's completed all the questions for tonight. So again, thanks very much for giving the talk, and thanks to Reese for being on board as well. The next webinar will be on the 26th of October, and that will be looking at beef particularly. So it will be concentrating on the R1s and yearlings, looking at beef finishing directly off the fodder beet, and also fodder beet for suckler cows as well. We'll then have the dairy section on the 27th of October, the sheep one on the 2nd of November, and finally the agronomy one on the 9th of November. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you on those days. Thanks again. Good night.
Thank you, Mark. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.